Hey everybody, it's Professor Keegan back with a video lecture for week 4 of our class, Gender and Pop Culture. Last week we started developing skills in reading for examples of the male gaze. And I very much enjoyed looking at your discussion groups, and you'll be getting feedback back from me soon on those entries. Um, this week, we are adding to that analysis of gender that we started building in week 2, an analysis of race, an intersectional analysis of race, gender, and sexuality is where we're heading. This week, we're adding race as a lens that we don't see classical white film theory really engaging very much. Mulvey is, to some extent, guilty of that because she adopts psychoanalytic frameworks for her theory of the male gaze. So this week we are looking at a piece called The Oppositional Gaze by Bell Hooks, who's a very famous Black feminist theorist and writer who recently passed away, and whose work continues to be really important to Black cultural studies. So I had you read this essay or chapter from her book, Black Looks, which was one of the first books to really analyze cinema from a Black feminist perspective. You'll notice that she cites some people we've already heard from in the class, including Stuart Hall, Mulvey. You might be able to hear my cat scratching on the door. Hopefully she'll stop eventually. Um, and Hooks is really engaging with cultural theory and film theory and saying, hey, both these bodies of theory are not doing a great job centering Black female perspectives on culture. I'm starting you out with this still from Gone with the Wind, which we'll get back to at the end of the lecture. This is a film from 1939, I believe, that won the Oscar the same year that The Wizard of Oz came out. And I want to talk a bit about Hattie McDaniel's performance playing this Mammy character in that film in a bit as an example of some of what Hooks is talking about here. So let's get started unpacking the reading a little bit. I wanted to give you a few slides, just key points from this reading. It's a little, I think it's fairly clear as a reading, but it's a little on the long side and you might have gotten a little swamped. So some key points from this piece, right? Is a very well-known essay in which Bell Hooks assesses the utility of Mulvey's theory of the male gaze, specifically for Black women spectators. So notice how she's critiquing Mulvey. She's saying some aspects of this are useful, but some aspects of this are also too simplistic to really account for racially different ways of looking, particularly within women's spectatorship. So notice that Hooks is introducing an intersectional approach to Mulvey's analysis, saying, hey, once you're situating yourself inside classical cinematic aesthetics, which we talked about last week, you're already in an environment where Blackness has been historically segregated off screen or relegated to these really inferior roles on screen. And so you're not operating in a racially neutral space. And because of that, you can't just build theories and think that they're going to describe power relations accurately, right? So she really takes Mulvey to task for using psychoanalytic theory to build her critique, because it's a body of theory that doesn't really consider race as foundational to human psychology, which would be wrong, right? So she's like, hey, Hooks is like, hey, we got to think about race simultaneously with gender all the time, or else we're not being intersectional. We're going to miss things. So note that Mulvey only imagines women as white. I mean, it's fine to say the male gaze is constructed as white and operates as white. That is true. It reflects dominant power. But Mulvey's theory of oppression within the look also naturalizes the object as white, right? The white woman's perspective, which is the oppressed position, remains white in her analysis. And that is a problem. So one really important thing to note here is that Hooks points out how, as a Black woman spectator of cinema, she is neither the bearer of the look, meaning a male gazing subject, right? She's neither the bearer of the look, but she's also not the object of the look. right? Neither of the positions Mulvey theorizes allow for Black women to be in them. So the theory totally erases Black women. Some more points, right? So there's the critique, and then there's the theorization that Hooks develops to propose a new theory of looking, right? So we know she's critiquing Mulvey, but she's also pointing out that there's specific ways of looking that Black people have developed precisely because of the history of enslavement in a North American context, where enslaved African people were punished for looking at white people, right? So there's this, while white men have been encouraged to look and gaze and, objectify, Black people, both men and women, have been prevented from doing that by the relations of racial domination. So we can't just say that the look is primarily gendered or sexualized. We have to also think about that history of race and recognize that looking is also a function of race and racial power dynamics. So Black people, by and large, historically in a US context, really, is what Hooks is addressing, have shared this experience of being told not to look or being punished for looking at the wrong things. And there's a real, when we get to looking at Get Out later, Jordan Peele's film about Black experience and white racism, we're going to be thinking about this theory. Does it help us understand that film better, right? Because what Hooks is saying is, like, Black people, by and large, outside of just gender differences between Black men and women, all kind of have developed what she calls this oppositional gaze. And she characterizes it as a gaze that knows it shouldn't look, but looks anyway, right? It defies white injunction to not look, and it also critically interrogates white sort of meaning systems. So to critically interrogate means to question and be like, really? Really? Right? So it defies and it questions what it sees. And she says, Black men still do have tangential access to the male gaze. It's more open to them than it is to Black women, right? Black men can look along with the male gaze in certain instances where race isn't as important to what's going on the screen. But Black women cannot identify with the male gaze or the white feminine object of that look, right? So Black women are uniquely positioned to not have any point of identification within classical cinema. So Hooke says, this illustrates why we need a different set of theories for how Black women look at media, because we know Black women consume media. So how are they doing this without just feeling erased or depressed or angry, right? How do Black women extract pleasure from cinema and from visual images? So that's Hooks's theory of the oppositional gaze, right? She says that Black women have developed this ability to critically distance themselves from media content and to conduct interrogative formal analysis of what they're seeing. And so she calls it the oppositional Black female gaze. And it has some qualities that I'd like you to make sure to pay attention to. So you might want to write these down for your discussion that I'll have you engage in later, right? The first quality, Hooke says that this female gaze develops new ways to look outside of and also in resistance to white supremacy, as well as gender inequality simultaneously. It also reads for ruptures and breaks in both white and male gazes. So it's looking for where those relations of looking don't line up quite, or there are gaps or places within them that can be exploited, or places where they reveal their own constructedness, right? We did this with the Monroe number a couple weeks back, where there's sort of she's doing the preferred reading for the male audience, right? But then she turns to the other women and she's like, actually, there are gaps here that we can exploit, and let me tell you about them, right? So thinking about where the dominant relations of power and their aestheticization break down or create spaces where people can find other kinds of meaning. This gaze also creates looking relations in which visual delight pleasure, right, is produced by a specific pleasure of interrogation, right? So we talked about visual pleasure 2 weeks back, and the pleasure implicit in the male gaze is one of mastery and having the object arranged for your pleasure, right? If it's not, then you have to find other sources of pleasure when watching, right? So the pleasure of questioning and pushing against and looking for oppositional readings is part of this gaze. And with the ultimate goal of this gaze is to make the possibility of Black women's freedom legible somehow, right? Like that's the dominant reason why the gaze looks to begin with, is to find these gaps, to find these spaces where the image reveals the possibility of freedom for Black women, okay? It's harder to do because it requires more critical skill than just reading for preferred readings of the male gaze, which were in your journal or in your discussion essays. Most of you were really good at looking through the male gaze and finding instances of it because we've all been trained to look that way. So it's really obvious. It's a lot harder to read oppositionally. And I ended up commenting on quite a few people's discussion entries that you needed to work on this harder because it's harder to view dominant culture from subjugated positions, right? And when you add race on top of it, it gets even harder. That's my cat. Apologies. So some key quotes here from the material. I'm just going to give you 4 that I think are really important, and they're really short. They're really simple. Hooks is a very succinct writer. 1, not only will I stare, I want my look to change reality. So it's not just about looking and absorbing. There's a secondary agenda here, which is looking for things that help me imagine a different world, right? Looking for gaps in dominant relations of power that therefore illustrate what could be possible in the actual world, right? 2, there is a critical gaze, one that looks to document, that is oppositional, right? So the way in which we talked about Black people being told not to look and looking anyway, just to be like, I see what you're doing, white people, right? Like, you tell me not to look, but I see. You tell me that I'm like that the system of racial domination is just natural, but I don't believe you, and I see what you're doing, right? This sort of defiant, critical, resistant, questioning gaze that documents white dominance and white supremacist behaviors. She says one looks in a certain way in order to resist, not to buy in or just to get pleasure from being immersed in a text, but to resist it, to figure out how to resist it, to build that skill. And toward the end of the piece, she writes, looking and looking back, Black women see our history as counter memory, meaning a different history of memory. Using it as a way to know the present, like what's right in front of me? What do I need to know to survive the current moment? And also to invent a future that could be different from the current moment. So that's Hooks. And it's a really useful theory. And again, it requires more critical work, particularly if we are white people who are not used to having to think about race when we look at media. Several people in the journals on the Monroe number pointed out that all the women dressed in Black had brunette hair and were made into objects in the number, but almost nobody picked up that that was an implicit racial hierarchy being implied. Like, why is blondness the most beautiful thing, right? Let's start working on getting some racial analysis into our pop culture consumption. So I wanted to give you some examples. Hattie McDaniel's performance in Gone with the Wind was an Oscar-winning performance. I believe she was the first Black woman to ever win an Oscar. And, Gone with the Wind is known for being a pretty, we could say, racist text. It really does memorialize the South as this wonderful kind of lost romantic place, or the chivalry of the Southern way of life prior to the Civil War. And it's really interesting to watch Hattie McDaniel's performance. Here she is in this role of a slave. who's supposed to have no power or agency, right, legally or politically. And yet in the movie, there are all these moments where she kind of looks at the camera a little bit and performs this amazing awareness of the limitations of the white people around her's perception. She can see through their assumptions about race, and she can see what's coming with the war, right? And her performance is, I would encourage you to find a couple of clips on YouTube or something of her performance in this film, because it is a really good illustration of exactly what Hooks is talking about. Here is an actress performing a role that she knows is for white audiences, where she is simultaneously also performing a black criticality about the white people in the movie, and her kind of awareness of their limitations and their assumptions. It's a genius performance. It is maybe one of the best performances in film ever, and it does illustrate a lot of what Hooks is talking about. I have a few clips here, or stills here for you. They do not capture her actual like moving image performance of this role. So fast forwarding almost a century, I have a discussion prompt for you that's going to make you go back and re-examine some things from 2 weeks ago, now that we have more theory under our belts. So I would like you, for this discussion, to watch the music video for Diamonds by Megan Thee Stallion and Normani. Now, this is an update of Monroe's 1953 number. It's not the first one. I mentioned it's that Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend has been remade and remade many, many times. But this one is interesting, I think, from the perspective of Hooks's theory. I've provided a link to that video below this video on Blackboard, and I've also linked it in the discussion prompt. So I'd like you to watch that. Make sure you turn on the subtitles so you get the lyrics. And I have 3 things I want you to cover here. One, first of all, I would like you to compare and contrast this video with the original from 2 weeks ago. What is different here? And to use Hooks's terminology, how does this version, the Megan Thee Stallion version, critically interrogate, question the values, assumptions, and power dynamics of the original number? How does it comment on it critically? 2, I'd like you to bring in a couple of quotes from Hooks to help explain how the oppositional gaze might be operating here. And 3, I would like you to talk now about how your original reading of the Monroe number has shifted after these discussions. What are you noticing that you didn't your first time watching it? And to do this, I would actually really encourage you to go back to your original post and read it again, and read my feedback as well as other people's responses to you. What are you now able to pick up on that you didn't see the first time, because you now have a more sophisticated idea of how aesthetics work, right? Do not forget to reply to somebody as well by Tuesday evening, okay? So I will put this prompt up under groups and discussions, and I look forward to reading your responses to this, okay? It was great talking to you again. If you have questions, please do email me, and I'll look forward to seeing what you make of all this.